All right, ready to dive into something fascinating.
Always up for a good deep dive. What are we exploring today?
Today it's Biased, a book by Jennifer L. Eberhardt. It's about, well, bias. The hidden kind. The kind that shapes us without us even knowing.
Implicit bias. Such an important but often overlooked topic.
Exactly. And Eberhardt is a leading expert in the field. She even won a MacArthur Genius Grant for her work.
Very impressive. So how does she approach this complex subject?
Well, she starts with her own experiences with racism and bias, weaving personal anecdotes into the research, which makes it very relatable.
Makes sense. Sharing personal experiences can help ground complex topics and make them more accessible.
Right, like she talks about moving to a predominantly white suburb as a child, and how even though people were outwardly welcoming, she still experienced those subtle hints of bias.
I see. That feeling of being welcomed but not fully accepted. It's something a lot of people can probably relate to on some level.
Absolutely. It makes you think, right? Have you ever felt that way, like you were on the outside looking in?
More than I care to admit. But that's part of why it's so important to understand this concept of implicit bias. It's often operating below the surface, influencing our perceptions and actions without us even realizing it.
Exactly. And one of the key concepts Eberhardt explores is the other race effect. It's this phenomenon where our brains are wired to recognize faces we're familiar with.
Which means we often have more difficulty distinguishing between faces of people from different racial or ethnic backgrounds.
Exactly. Think about it. You probably find it easier to tell apart the faces of people from your own background.
It's true. We create these mental shortcuts, and sometimes those shortcuts lead to bias. It's like our brain is saying familiar equals safe, and unfamiliar equals potentially dangerous.
And Eberhardt illustrates this with a real-world example, a series of robberies in Oakland's Chinatown. Asian women were having a really hard time identifying the suspects who were black because of this other race effect.
It's a powerful example of how something that might seem insignificant, like difficulty recognizing faces, can have a huge impact on people's lives.
Totally. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Eberhardt then takes us deeper into the science of bias. She talks about this fascinating study she did at Stanford. Participants were primed with words related to crime, and guess what happened? They started focusing more on black faces.
That's what's known as the Black Crime Association. This automatic link between blackness and criminal activity exists in many people's minds, often unconsciously.
It's unsettling, isn't it? And what's even crazier is that this association affects how we perceive not just people, but objects as well.
There was another study where participants were subliminally exposed to black faces, meaning they weren't even aware they saw them. And those participants were then faster to recognize crime-related objects. Subliminal exposure, wow.
It's like our brains are filling in the blanks of pre-existing stereotypes. We see a black face and our minds automatically jump to crime, even if we don't consciously endorse that belief. It really makes you think.
It's a sobering reminder of how deeply ingrained these biases can be, and it makes you wonder, how are these biases playing out in the real world?
Well, that's what Eberhardt tackles next. She dives into the impact of unconscious bias on law enforcement, and the results are, frankly, alarming. One of her most impactful studies is the shoot-don't-shoot simulation. Participants, including police officers, were put in a scenario where they had to decide to shoot or not shoot a person holding either a gun or a harmless object.
And I'm guessing the results revealed a disturbing pattern.
You guessed it. Participants were far more likely to mistakenly shoot unarmed black men compared to unarmed white men.
It's a stark illustration of how these unconscious biases can have life or death consequences.
It's a chilling reminder of how much work we still need to do. And Eberhardt goes even further, analyzing data from the Oakland Police Department, revealing a pattern of disproportionate stops, searches, and arrests of black people, even when controlling for other factors.
Clearly, there's a systemic issue within law enforcement. But it's not just about individual officers, it's about the culture and the systems that perpetuate these biases.
Absolutely. Like Eberhardt talks about the constant radio chatter police officers are exposed to, hearing descriptions like male, black repeatedly. It reinforces that black crime association, even if it's unintentional.
It's like a constant drip feed of bias, shaping their perceptions without them even realizing it.
And to make it even more personal, Eberhardt bravely shares her own experience with a racially charged arrest in Boston. She was wrongly accused of assaulting a police officer, highlighting the fear and power dynamics that often permeate police interactions, especially with Black individuals.
It's a stark reminder that even seemingly minor instances of disrespect from law enforcement can escalate quickly and have devastating consequences.
It really highlights the need for police reform and training to address these deeply ingrained biases. And it's not just about major incidents of police brutality. Eberhardt also discusses the concept of a respect deficit in communication with Black drivers.
I see. So even subtle cues of disrespect, like tone of voice or body language, can escalate tension and lead to negative outcomes.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that how we communicate, even in seemingly small ways, can have a profound impact on how an interaction unfolds.
It's a powerful point. And it makes you realize how widespread this issue is, how bias permeates so many aspects of our society.
Absolutely. While policing is a major focus of the book, Eberhardt also emphasizes that bias extends far beyond that realm.
Right. It impacts how we interact with each other in countless ways, shaping our perceptions and decisions across all areas of life. It's about more than just individual prejudice. It's about how those prejudices are embedded in our systems and institutions.
That's a great point. And Eberhardt doesn't shy away from exploring the historical roots of all of this, the disturbing history of scientific racism that contributed to the dehumanization of Black people.
A dark chapter in history for sure, but one that we need to acknowledge and understand to truly address the problem of bias today.
Absolutely. She connects this history to her own research on the Black Ape Association and how it caused discomfort, even among her own scientific colleagues.
I can imagine. It's a topic that many would rather avoid, but Eberhardt bravely confronts it head-on, showing how deeply embedded these associations are, even in the scientific community.
And she brings it even closer to home with a personal anecdote about encountering a fearful reaction from a white mother and daughter simply because she was Black.
It's a sobering reminder that these biases operate on a very personal level, shaping our interactions in ways we may not even realize.
And it's not just about individual interactions. Eberhardt also explores how physical spaces and technology are both influenced by and contribute to bias. She talks about housing segregation and how it continues to impact perceptions of neighborhoods.
It's like those historical lines of segregation still have an invisible hold on us, shaping who we see as our neighbors and where we feel comfortable living.
It's amazing how something as seemingly neutral as physical space can be so charged with meaning and bias.
And then there's technology, which is supposed to connect us, but can also reinforce our biases. Like, have you ever seen those posts on Nextdoor where someone reports a suspicious person who just happens to be a person of color?
It's disturbing how easily those platforms can be used to amplify fear and suspicion, often targeting people based on their race or ethnicity.
It's a reminder that technology is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used for good or bad. It's up to us to use it responsibly and be aware of how our own biases might be playing out online.
That's so true. And Eberhardt provides a counterpoint to Nextdoor with Airbnb, a platform that's made efforts to combat discrimination. Their instant book feature has actually been shown to reduce bias in host selections.
It's encouraging to see companies taking concrete steps to address bias in their platforms. It shows that change is possible. It's not just about raising awareness, it's about creating systems and structures that make it harder for bias to influence our choices.
And that's a great segue to the next part of our deep dive, where we'll explore Eberhardt's suggestions for how we can challenge and overcome unconscious bias.
I'm looking forward to it. Because while the reality of bias can feel overwhelming, Eberhardt ultimately offers a message of hope. It's not about feeling defeated, it's about understanding the problem so we can start finding solutions.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into bias. Remember where we left off? We were talking about how pervasive bias is and how deeply ingrained it is in our systems and even in ourselves. It's a heavy topic. But you know what impressed me most about Eberhardt's book? She doesn't just leave us with the problem, she actually offers potential solutions.
Right. It's not just about raising awareness. It's about empowering ourselves to make a difference. It's hopeful, even though the topic is, challenging. And you know what really stuck with me? Her discussion of what she calls wise feedback.
Oh, yes, that was from her time teaching at San Quentin prison, right? The part about how her students, who were incarcerated, really craved constructive criticism.
Yeah, exactly. Even if the feedback was tough to hear, they really saw it as a way to learn and grow. They valued it. Isn't that fascinating?
It is. It really makes you think about how we often shy away from giving or receiving tough feedback in our everyday lives. We don't want to hurt feelings or create conflict.
Right. It can be uncomfortable.
Uh-huh.
But Eberhardt makes a really compelling case for why this wise feedback is so crucial for addressing bias. It's about creating a culture where we can learn from our mistakes and hold each other accountable, but in a constructive way.
I like that constructive way because it's not about attacking each other or being judgmental. It's about genuinely wanting to help each other grow and become more aware of our biases.
Exactly. It's about creating a space where we can have those difficult conversations, but with empathy and understanding.
And that goes for both giving and receiving feedback. It takes courage to be open to hearing about our blind spots, but it's essential for personal growth and ultimately for creating a more just world.
It's about being willing to challenge our own assumptions and be open to different perspectives. But, Eberhardt also acknowledges that individual change is only part of the equation. She really stresses the importance of systemic change as well.
Ah, yes, because individual actions, while important, can only go so far, right? We need to address those larger systems and structures that perpetuate bias if we want to see real lasting change.
That's exactly it. She argues that we need to create systems that actually minimize the influence of bias in our decisions, whether it's in our workplaces, our schools, or even our legal systems.
Because our institutions are often built on a foundation of historical bias, right? So it's not enough to just focus on changing individual attitudes. We have to dismantle those systemic biases that are baked into the very fabric of our society. It's about looking at those historical biases that still affect us today.
A great example of that is the criminal justice system, right? Eberhardt talks about how Black people are disproportionately represented at every stage, from arrest to sentencing. And it's not just about individual prejudice, it's about policies and practices that have been in place for decades.
It's a complex issue with deep roots, and that's what makes Eberhardt's work so valuable. She helps us to understand the nuances of these issues, how history and current systems are intertwined. It's about questioning the status quo, right? Like challenging those systems and structures that have historically disadvantaged certain groups.
Exactly. It's about having the courage to say, hey, this isn't working. We need to find a better way. Like, think about hiring practices. Eberhardt advocates for using blind recruitment techniques, where you remove identifying information like names and photos from applications.
Yeah, to try and level the playing field a bit, right? By taking away those cues that might trigger unconscious bias, you force employers to focus on the qualifications of the candidates, rather than on factors that are irrelevant to their ability to do the job.
Exactly. It's a simple change, but it could have a huge impact. And it's just one example of how we can start to create more equitable systems.
Right. It's about putting those checks and balances in place to minimize the influence of bias.
And you know what else Eberhardt stresses? The importance of accountability. She argues that we need to hold individuals and institutions responsible for discriminatory actions if we want to see real change.
Because without accountability, people and institutions can just continue to perpetuate those harmful practices, right? It's about making it clear that there are consequences for bias, whether it's intentional or not.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond lip service and actually taking concrete steps to create a more just and equitable world.
Yeah.
And, Eberhardt acknowledges that this work is not easy. It's going to be uncomfortable. There will be resistance. But she argues that discomfort is actually necessary for growth and progress.
Right. It's about embracing that discomfort, seeing it as an opportunity to learn and unlearn. It's like we've been operating on autopilot for so long, relying on those ingrained biases, and now it's time to wake up and start making conscious choices.
Exactly. It's about having the courage to challenge our own assumptions and be willing to change our minds. It's about being open to learning from our mistakes and from each other.
And, Eberhardt doesn't pretend to have all the answers. She acknowledges that addressing bias is complex, it's multifaceted, and it requires constant effort and collaboration. It's not about achieving some kind of perfect state of unbiasedness, because that probably doesn't exist. It's about constantly striving to be more aware, more inclusive, and more just in our interactions with the world and with each other.
I like that. It's an ongoing process. And you know what else I appreciate about her approach? She really emphasizes the importance of hope. She doesn't leave us feeling defeated. She reminds us that we have the power to change the narrative.
That's so important, because it can be easy to feel overwhelmed by the enormity of the problem. But Eberhardt reminds us that even small steps taken collectively can have a ripple effect.
That's what gives me hope. It's about recognizing that each of us has a role to play, no matter how big or small. And, even amidst all the hard truths she lays out, the book ultimately ends on a note of hope, this idea that even though bias is deeply rooted, our capacity for change is even deeper.
I love that. It's a reminder that we're not doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. We have the power to choose a different path, a more just and equitable path.
So powerful. And on that note, let's move to the final part of our deep dive, where we'll delve into some of Eberhardt's more specific suggestions for confronting and mitigating the impacts of unconscious bias in our everyday lives. It's about getting practical, about figuring out what we can actually do to make a difference.
Sounds good, because knowledge without action is, well, it's not enough. We need to take what we've learned and turn it into positive change. Let's do it.
We're back, wrapping up our deep dive into Jennifer Eberhardt's Biased. It's been, well, pretty eye-opening, right?
Yeah, it really makes you think about the role bias plays in all of our lives. But one thing I appreciate about this book is that it doesn't just leave us with the problem, it gives us a path forward. It offers hope.
Yeah, absolutely. So much of it comes down to, taking action. And Eberhardt gives us some great starting points. Remember how we talked about wise feedback in the last part?
Oh, yeah, that really struck a chord with me, especially her experience teaching at San Quentin and how those incarcerated students craved constructive criticism, even when it was tough to hear.
It's kind of counterintuitive, right? We tend to avoid tough conversations, but Eberhardt argues that being able to give and receive that wise feedback is essential for actually addressing bias.
It's about creating a culture where, we're not afraid to call each other out, but we do it with empathy and a genuine desire to help each other grow.
Exactly. It's not about attacking each other. It's about holding each other accountable, but in a way that's supportive and constructive. And, it takes courage on both sides, both to give that feedback and to be open to receiving it.
Oh, for sure. It can be really uncomfortable to hear that we've messed up or that we have blind spots. But you know what? That discomfort is often a sign that we're actually learning and growing. And that's a good thing.
I totally agree. But Eberhardt also makes it clear that individual change isn't enough, right?
Yeah.
We need to look at the bigger picture, those systems and structures that perpetuate bias.
Ah, yes. Because sometimes those systems are so ingrained, so normalized that we don't even see them as biased. It's just, the way things are. So we need to challenge those assumptions, those ways of doing things that might seem neutral on the surface, but actually disadvantage certain groups.
It's like questioning the status quo and asking ourselves, is this system truly fair? Does it serve everyone equally? And if the answer is no, well, then we need to be willing to change it.
It's about being willing to shake things up, to disrupt those patterns of inequality. And, Eberhardt offers some concrete examples of what that might look like. Remember how we talked about blind recruitment techniques in hiring?
Oh, yeah. That's where you strip away identifying information like names and photos from applications so that the hiring manager is focusing solely on skills and qualifications.
Exactly. By removing those potential triggers for unconscious bias, we can help level the playing field a bit and give everyone a fair shot.
It's such a simple idea, but it could make a huge difference. It's about creating systems that actually promote fairness and equity.
And it's not just about designing new systems, it's also about holding individuals and institutions accountable for their actions. Because without accountability, change is hard to come by, right?
Totally. It's about making it clear that there are consequences for discriminatory actions and systems. It's about moving beyond those empty promises and actually taking concrete steps to create a more just world.
Because talk is cheap, right? We need action. And sometimes that action is going to be uncomfortable. It might involve having tough conversations, admitting we were wrong, or making changes that disrupt the status quo.
That discomfort is necessary, though. It's a sign that we're actually challenging those deeply ingrained biases and working towards something better.
It's like we've been sleepwalking through this issue for too long. It's time to wake up, be honest with ourselves, and do the work.
So well said. And while Eberhardt offers a lot of guidance and practical strategies, she also acknowledges that there's no quick fix. This is ongoing work, and it requires us to be humble, open-minded, and willing to learn and adapt as we go.
It's a journey, not a destination, right? There's no magical point where we can say, okay, we're done with bias, we've solved it. It's about constantly striving to be better, more aware, and more just in our interactions with the world.
It's about progress, not perfection. And even amidst the heavy realities, Eberhardt reminds us that we have to hold on to hope. We have the power to change the narrative.
That's what keeps me going, honestly, because it's easy to get discouraged, to feel overwhelmed by the enormity of the problem. But we can't give up. Every small step we take, every conversation we have, every action we take to dismantle bias is a step in the right direction.
So powerful. And as we wrap up our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with this thought. We all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world.
It's a collective effort, and it starts with each of us. So let's commit to doing our part, no matter how small, to challenge bias and create a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Biased is more than just a book. It's a call to action. And we hope this deep dive has inspired you to answer that call. Thanks for joining us.